Hello there. Good evening, everyone. My name's John Parker, and I'm Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association here in Stonehouse in the UK. Welcome to you all for the latest Wednesday webinar, our 33rd webinar, the big 3-3. Is that a thing? I'm not sure it is. Anyway, please say hello in the chat and let us know where you're watching from. But as ever, please make sure you select all panelists and attendees when you do so. Questions via the Q&A button, please. Before we get started, I have to announce a late change to this evening's programme. Stefan Rust is unfortunately unwell and will therefore be unable to speak tonight. I'm sure you'll all join us in wishing him a speedy recovery. Needless to say, we look forward to welcoming him to a webinar in the future. Stefan sends his apologies to everyone, but he's also very kindly helped coordinate a replacement speaker, so panic not, because we're hugely grateful to Andy Detter from Tree Consult in Germany for agreeing to step in at what was very short notice, which is to say, we only spoke on the phone about this for the first time at 3 o'clock this afternoon. So thank you, Andy. Andy's presentation will be about the importance of wind and tree interaction in current methods of tree risk assessments. So interesting stuff. He's just appeared as if by magic. And if you registered purely for the tomography, then please don't fear. This will certainly be covered by Philip van Wassenaer's presentation and in the discussion afterwards. Next week, there will not be a webinar. I'm sorry, forgive us. But don't worry, because we'll be back on Wednesday, February the 24th, so that's the week after next, at the usual time, with a special webinar all about Westernbert, the National Arboretum, which is also in Gloucestershire, of course. We'll be hearing from the from the Westernbert tree team about the whole process, all the way through from seed collection, propagation, planting, management, maintenance, as well as some of their current projects and future plans. What can arboriculturalists and urban foresters learn from the work which goes on in an arboretum? Hopefully you can come and find out. The registration link for that will be in the chat at some point. Just to whet your appetite, the Westernbert special will be the first of 5 webinars in 5 weeks, which will lead us up to a very exciting event indeed, the Fungi Symposium, with Lynn Body and friends at the end of March. There's lots more information about that coming soon. And if you absolutely can't possibly go without a webinar for a whole week, then there is some light at the end of the tunnel, because on February the 20th, so that's Saturday of next week, the Arboricultural Association will be helping host an online event for the Stonehouse Community Climate Action Forum, which I'll be chairing. That might put you off or attract you, I'm not sure. And at which I'll be giving a brief talk about the Stonehouse Community Arboretum. So if you've got no plans for Saturday between midday and 2 o'clock, you might like to consider joining us to learn a little more about the great work going on locally in our community here and what the Arboricultural Association is doing to help out locally as well. The link to that is also in the chat, or you can email me at john@trees.org.uk for more information about this or anything else you might care to talk about. Right. Let's get to it. Questions in the questions box, chat in the chat box. Remember to select all panelists and attendees before writing your message. We've got 2 great presentations ahead. As I've already mentioned, later on, we're going to be hearing from Andy Detter. But first of all, it is my great pleasure to welcome Philip van Wassenaer all the way from Canada to the virtual stage. Philip, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to get my presentation up. Okay, well, thank you very much, John, and to the Arboricultural Association for the invitation to speak today. It's always a pleasure to work with my friends in the UK. And from what I understand, it's not just people in the UK on this webinar. There's people from all over. So welcome to everyone, and thanks for coming. My name is Philip van Wassenaer. I'm an urban forestry consultant based just outside of Toronto, Canada. And I run a consultancy with about 8 folks here. And I'd like to say we're broadly specialized in the niche of urban forestry. And so my talk today, as you can see from the title, is Views from the Top, an expedition to the Redwood Canopy. And I would say that this is a somewhat light on technical, but rich on lots of images. And the intention of this talk, when I first put it together years ago, was simply to share with other people who might have an interest in getting to the redwood forests and getting up in the trees what my experience was, because it's just not that easy to go there By rights, most of these forests are protected and you're not supposed to climb the trees. So I always had a dream of getting to the redwoods, and I kind of knew the only way to do it was through a research opportunity, and that's what this story is about. So I've had the good pleasure of working in the Western United States. My friend Scott Baker in the city of Seattle invited me in the early 2000s to do some advanced risk assessment with tomography and tree pulling tests. And in exchange for helping him, I said, well, you have to take me up a big tree because I look at all these big trees around me, but I'd love to go up one. So we engaged our friend Matt, who's here with the Big Shot, and we went to a park in Seattle and we climbed a Douglas fir tree. And it was about 175 feet tall, or 53 meters. So for me, that's already close to twice as tall as the trees that I usually work with. And when we got right up to the top, we got this stunning view looking out across the lake at the city and over the tops of the trees. And that was the beginning of my big tree addiction. From there, I got an opportunity working with Scott. He's done a lot of work with the Treehouse community. And I was invited to this location, the Out and About Tree Resort in Southern Oregon, to give a lecture at the Global Treehouse Symposium. And this is just a wonderful place. I suggest you look it up. And if you ever have a chance, go and try and have a visit there. They have 14 different tree houses. Michael Garnier, one of the fathers of treehouse building, built this place. So it's quite interesting. And they offer many things besides staying in the tree houses. And one of them, oh, this is Michael Garnier's house on the property. It's a tree house, but of full house proportions. One of the things that you can do while you're staying at the tree house, if you're so inclined, is to go and climb some big trees. And of course, being there with Scott, I said, well, let's get up the next biggest tree. So we took a hike up the ridge, and they have some trees that they have lines rigged in so that we could go up. And our colleague Michael was over in the top of this tree across from us. And, the tree we climbed was about 225 feet tall, 70 meters. And you get a perspective here. We were right up on the top of the ridge. If we looked one way, we could see over the valley there. And if we looked the other side of the ridge, we look back down to where our treehouse conference was. And actually next door here, they were having a sort of an outdoor folk music festival. And while we were up here at sunset, we were serenaded by the music from the folk festival and taking in the views. So that was the beginning. And then after those climbs with Scott, we said, well, really, we can't get much. The only way to get into taller trees would be to get to the redwoods somehow. And it's a little bit of a twisted story, but I began reading research papers from an author by the name of Steve Sillett in the early 90s, actually, because I was looking at Canopy gap research, and I stumbled upon his Canopy research and was really fascinated by it. And over the years, I would look him up periodically and read some of his papers. In 2007, I actually got up the nerve to send an email to Mr. Sillett and say, well, I'm a tree climber, I'm a consulting arborist, I have a research background. If you ever needed a field assistant, I'd love to come and work with you. But I recognized that he probably had lots of those offers. And I said, well, if you don't get back to me, I understand. By happenstance, in 2008, the following year, Steve Sillett was the keynote speaker at the ISA International Conference. And him and a colleague put on a workshop on measuring big trees. So I attended that workshop. And before you know it, I was talking with Steve. He actually did remember my email. And we got talking somehow on the subject of tomography. And his eyes lit up and he said, "Do you know something about that?" And I said, well, I actually do. And one of the things he said is that they would be quite interested in tomography because they find all kinds of interesting animals, organisms way up in the tree, and they know they must be living inside the tree somewhere, but they're having a tough time finding them. And they had been using increment cores, for example, to probe areas where they thought there might be cavities or decay, but the damage of that was not particularly attractive to them. So at the end of that conversation, Steve said, well, would you come down to California and see if we can make this work on the redwoods? And I said, you better believe it. So that was my ticket to actually get to the redwoods. And so that was in August, and I didn't waste any time putting the trip together. And in November, we went down to the redwoods. So just a bit about some of the work that Steve Sillett does. He's really one of the preeminent canopy researchers in North America, specifically on the sequoias, either the sempervirens or the giganticum. And the hallmark of his research is how meticulous it is, and the extent to which they are thorough. So in this photograph, you can see these little red circles, and these are researchers at the top of a couple of giant sequoia trees. And this is just one study they looked at. They looked at every tree across a hectare of land, and because they're giant, there's only 115 trees there, but they studied these trees in every way: their height, the number of branches, foliage, and etc. But one of the aspects of this study was really looking at the biodiversity in the forest. And what they found out is that of those 115 trees, 12 trees had 95% of the biodiversity in the canopy. And sure enough, those were almost all sort of old, broken trees, broken tops, fire scars, features of the tree which create habitat for other species. And this is another paper that Steve Sillett put together with Robert Van Pelt. And Robert has been working on really trying to graphically show some of the complexity. And this, I always love the title of this paper. It's called "A Redwood Tree Whose Crown May Be the Most Complex on Earth." And you see that this is an old redwood, and when they break, they do they make what are called reiterations. They grow these little new stems from where the breaks occurred. And it's that complexity of the canopy and the length of time that it exists that starts to create niches for habitat. So in some of the ancient redwoods, they found things like here in the top left corner, there's a salamander. We're used to seeing those salamanders under logs on the forest floor, not up hundreds of meters or feet up in the canopy. We found freshwater organisms that are more suited to being found in streams. They found those in pools of water. They found squirrels. They found bats. They also found other plants growing out of cavities in the trees. And then also you can see in the bottom center, I'm not sure if you see my cursor. Do you, John? In any case, in the bottom center, you see these two depictions of soil with some measurements beside them. And those are what they call aerial soils that develop in the crooks of branches, because over such a length of time, the leaf litter, the branch litter has the opportunity to decompose and create soil. And so you get communities living on that soil in the canopies of the trees. So just to step back a little bit and talk about the technological aspect of this talk. So we proposed, or Steve was interested in seeing how tomography could work to identify the internal condition of the trees and perhaps give them some clues where to look for some of the habitat features that support some of these biology that they'd found up in the canopy. So this this graphic here gives a very simple representation of how tomography works. We have a series of points around the tree. Each one of those points we would call a measuring point. And a measuring point is either a sending point when the nail strikes it, or the hammer strikes the nail, which you'll see. And that starts a sound wave going through the tree. All of the other measuring points would have a receiver on them, and they would receive the sound wave when it gets to the other side of the tree. So I'll start the graphic here. You see the hammer taps on the nail, and sound waves start to move around the tree, and the green light appears on the measuring points when the sound gets there. So the underlying approach, how we're developing an image of the internal condition of the tree is this is actually mapping sonic velocity. And if you go back in your science class, sonic or velocity is the distance divided by the time, and the ratio of that gives the speed of sound. So we can, under most circumstances, measure quite accurately the distance between the points around the outside of the tree, and the machine measures the time that it takes sound to travel between those points. So then we get that ratio, distance divided by time. If the example we had here did not have an area of decay or damaged wood and it was solid, as the distance between the points increases, the time also increases, and we would get a measurement across the plane where the speed of sound is almost the same, and that would be a solid tree. In the case that we see in front of us, damage, decay, cavity causes the sound can't travel through that area. So you saw how some of these lines bend around that area, and indeed we don't know which way around the cavity the sound goes, but what ends up happening is that it takes longer. So the calculation of distance divided by time ends up with a lower result. And so then that all gets plugged into the algorithms in the software. And here you can see some of the equipment, this is actually the PICAS 2 equipment, there's now a PICAS 3, but you see the sensors are mounted onto nails, and here's the hammer striking the nail to send the signal. What you end up with is images like we see on the right here. So in these tomograph images, and these are with a PICAS sonic tomograph. The coloring would be different with other tomographs, but in this one, shades of brown represent solid wood. The green is some sort of transition, and the violet and blue areas are where sound travels very slowly. So it's important to remember that this is a sound map of the tree, and we actually have to interpret what that means. But in most cases, when the sound isn't traveling well, then there's either decay or a cavity, in some cases cracks, but I won't get too down into the weeds of the analysis. But you can see beside the tomograph image, the actual tree, and you can see that there's a fairly good correlation between the sound map and the map of the actual decay in the tree, and the bottom example similarly. The other type of tomography which one can use, and we did use on this trip, is electrical resistance tomography. So instead of generating an image of how sound travels across the plane, electrical resistance tomography generates an image of how electricity is moving across the plane. So very basically, a current is introduced at the point marked I on these graphics, and at the points labeled as U, the voltage is measured. And so basically, that's about as far as I want to go into the technical of it. But what it does is it also creates images of the internal condition of the tree, but it's looking at resistance. And in these images, the colors show the blue colors are low resistance, the red colors are high resistance. So in this case here, we often, in many of these tomograms, we see blue around the outside where The xylem and phloem are where there is a lot of moisture and where resistance is low. The red areas tend to be drier wood where there's not as much moisture, so there's a higher resistance. And that resistance can be affected by the water content. In certain species, it may be by ions that are present in the wood, and it can also reflect cell structure. And here's just a quick show of the equipment. So you have a tomograph. This machine will be sending out the electric current and also recording the measurements. So you apply a current here in the middle, and the sensors are always paired with a positive and negative. They measure the voltage, and very quickly the data for the analysis is generated. And last couple of slides on this, what has been found so far is that there are different typical distributions for different types of trees that we see. So the type 1 here is most commonly seen with a lot of European species. And you see there that you have low resistance in the center, or high resistance in the center, low resistance on the outside. Couple of species looked at so far. So Sequoia dendron giganticum actually has this kind of pattern where you see low resistance more in the center and some areas of high resistance on the outside. And then the third type is quite typical pattern to see in a healthy oak, for example. And then so first thing, if you're using this technology, you have to kind of get an understanding of what your what the species you're working is, what the baseline should be, so you can compare. In our work out on the West Coast there, we did look at getting some samples from some younger, smaller trees. And this is more typical of a redwood. In fact, this is a redwood which probably has early decay in the center, but it has the blue around the outside, it has the red on the interior, and in this case there was a central column of decay developing with moisture, and so less resistance in the center of the tree. So I mentioned that we organized this expedition fairly quickly. So people that came along with me, this is at the box here is Lothar Gürke. He at the time was working for Argus Electronics and actually had imagined and engineered most of the equipment. So we needed him here because these trees weren't typical. They were much bigger, way more sensors than we usually used. We had to figure out how to have a longer chain. We needed to make special nails because the bark is so thick on these trees. We had 15 centimeter spring steel nails. And this was we asked Steve if he could give us some smaller trees to work with. And this was day one at the university grounds. And he called this a small tree, which for most of us is already a relatively large one. The gentleman standing up with the camera in his hand is Scott Baker. And because he had been on my climb to the tops of big trees journey and a very competent climber, I invited him to come along because we were going to need logistical help when we got up in the tree. And this gentleman here, Brian, worked extensively with Steve Sillett and his research group as a field assistant. And he's also quite known in our arboricultural community for his excellent drawings that he does. So after one day working on those quote unquote small trees, Steve took us out to the forest, and it had been raining for a couple of days, but this day, as we were driving out of Arcata, we had the rainbow, and we chased the rainbow back into the forest, and our pot of gold was one of the biggest trees you can ever imagine. So we were driving out of town into the forest, and it is a coastal rainforest, and that is what contributes to the opportunity for these trees to grow so big, because water is definitely rarely limited for them. And this is just a quick video as we turned off the highway and into the smaller road to head into our research site. I just wanted to give you a quick impression of, what what I saw the first time I went into a real redwood forest. And the video isn't fantastic. I was holding the camera outside of the car, but you can get this impression of this forest of giants. And the tract we were in is, I think it's I can't remember the name of the tract, but it's one of the few remaining tracts of really undisturbed old growth redwood forest. And many, if any of you know about the redwood forest, they met the fate of many of our forests and were mostly removed. And at this point, there's only about 5% of the original redwood forest that's in old growth status. So here we were, we drove in and we parked and we started to load up our gear. Here I have the tomograph case mounted onto a backpack. I'd never carried my tomograph in a backpack before, but Scott had a bunch of gear. We all loaded up because from here we had to carry everything in. And we headed off onto this relatively obscure little path and walked into the forest. One of our first, I call this a sort of an expedition because it really did involve some of those aspects. After walking for about 20 minutes, we came to the river, so we had to actually do a river fording. So Scott here had rubber boots, was quite lucky. Some of us waded across in our shorts. And in the right photo, we see actually Steve Sillett carrying our photographer. And by happenstance, while we were there, this is Nick Coons from the National Geographic, and him and his assistant worked for about 7 months gathering photographs for an article that got published. And he spent a couple of days with us actually photographing some of the work that we were doing. So it's quite, but he was the special person in the crew. He got carried across the creek. And on the other side, you really start to enter into, the big trees. So I mentioned that while we were on the university campus, we thought, this isn't a small tree. But once we got into the forest and started to see what the average tree was like, we realized why Steve would think that he had showed us a small tree. And we followed the researchers along their sort of quiet paths and eventually ended up here. And forgive the fuzziness, but you can see generally, a large forest of big trees. And in the center here, just to the right of where people are standing, backpack leaning against it, is the tree that that Steve wanted us to work on. In the end, and here you can get some idea about the size of the tree. At the base of the tree, the diameter at the base on ground was over 8 meters. It really was like taking a stroll just to walk around this tree. At the measuring level, we did our first tomograph. The tree was over 5 meters in diameter, and Steve Sillett and his group have been cataloging the large trees of these forests, not only in California but also in Australia with the giant eucalyptus, the Eucalyptus regnans, I think. And at that time, in 2008, they called this the 9th largest tree in the world based on wood volume, because you can see how big it was at the base. It actually has the stature of a giant sequoia at the base, but it extends up 110 meters, 360 feet tall, approximately. So really just a king giant tree. So as I mentioned, our challenge was to try and deliver for Steve tomograph images of this tree. Now, Steve's image was, he had us there for 5 or 6 days. He thought we'd have maybe 10 or 12 images from different levels up and down the tree. Unfortunately, the logistics of working on such a large tree didn't let us get there. But if anybody's done tomography before, a really big tree that we work with might have 20 to 25, 26 sensors. That's one of the biggest trees we would work with. When we were working at the base of the tree here, I think we had 65 different sensors. And, just taking a walk around and tapping 5 times on each of those nails was well over an hour to do that work. So one of the challenges and one of the important things with sonic tomography is to not only measure the distances, but to get a really good idea of the shape of the tree. And when we're working on the ground and working as consultants in someone's backyard, we have a very nice caliper. We can measure up to 2 meters, and we can do those measurements very quickly. Unfortunately, with a tree of this stature, none of our regular routines would work. But Bob came with us, and Bob has perfected, let's say, his techniques to really measure and describe the shape of the base of the trees, especially for the artistic renderings that he does of these trees. So he has here a measuring device mounted on a tripod, and we worked with him. I think it was at least a half a day doing all kinds of different measurements just to get the shape of the base of the tree. And here you can see, working on that, taking measurements and working at the forest floor. And as I said, just working our way around this tree and working at ground level was time consuming and quite an effort. I think this image is a good one if you see just to the right of the person who has the orange pants on, you can see sort of a dark area at the ground there. And that was kind of like a hole or almost like a cave going in there. And I'm just pointing it out because we'll actually see at the end when we see the tomograph images that there is some indication that this is decay that goes into the base of the tree. So after a day and a half that we spent, getting everything working and getting all the kinks out and getting the images for the base of the tree, now the real fun began. So we were now going to go up and try and get the second image. And because it took us almost 2 days to get the first image, Steve was already backing away on his expectations. And so we decided to go approximately halfway up the tree. Here you see my colleague Lothar in a rig to climb up the rope to get up there. To his extreme credit, this was the first tree that Lothar ever climbed in as an arborist. He climbed trees as a kid, but he never climbed a tree, never got on a rope, never had a harness to climb a big tree. Lo and behold, he had to go up one of the biggest trees in the world. And Steve was very patient and helped Lothar with his technique and with his fears to get up the rope. Here you can see Lothar on the left side, about halfway up, looking a little bit like a deer in the headlights and not entirely confident. And then on the right side, he was almost up to where he needed to be. We had established what's called a portal edge. It's technology that big wall climbers use so that they can sleep overnight comfortably. And it's basically a cot that you set up in the air. And we set that up for Lothar so he could sit up there and have all the technical equipment. The picture's a little bit fuzzy because those of you who have been on the rope before, if you have a free dangling rope, sometimes the kinks in the rope start to unravel and you start to turn around. And Lothar was spent about 3 minutes going around and around and around and almost getting sick to his stomach. So there was and even for me, I've been climbing all my life and climbing trees, but getting up these big trees was a heck of a lot of work. So here you see Steve taking off. He went once up before bringing some gear. For those of you, just a bit of a technical thing. If you're climbing trees or if you climbed on ropes, you know that if you put a backpack on your back, it makes things pretty difficult because you keep pulling backwards and you have to pull all that weight up with you. So what the researchers do, you can see here, they actually clip things on to their feet and carry the loads so that you can lift the loads with your legs and not be tilted backwards. That was another novel thing for me. And I actually carried my tomograph box on my feet up this tree, which was another new experience for me. So here you can see, this is looking up. The first branch on this tree was 150 feet off the ground. And so these are the first branches right here. And so not only were we climbing the tree, but you actually weren't climbing a tree, you're just climbing a free dangling rope. And to give you a perspective, when you get up to the top of our first measuring site, this is what it looked like from Lotar's perch, looking back down to the ground, and it's certainly a long way. And so this was one of the few images that was shared very kindly by Nick, the National Geographic photographer. The day we went up here, he went up another tree nearby and was taking photographs of us. But this gives you a good idea of the logistical challenges. So here you can see the yellow line going across the tree. That's our measuring tape. The diameter of the tree here was still well over 3 meters. And you know, we had to get, once again, all our nails set up, all our sensors set up. But we needed actually 3 climbers on rope. So this is myself in the middle in the blue. On the right side is Scott Baker. And at the back side, you can see up above is Steve. And so we had 3 ropes set up so that we could each cover a different part of the tree and pass the equipment back and forth. And you can see Lotar perched there. One interesting thing about the size of this tree that it's hard to convey is that Lotar and Scott, who were on opposite sides of the tree, despite being up there together for about 6 hours, never saw each other while they were up in the tree because the tree's just too big to allow for that. And so then once we, you know, you can imagine once again the sort of challenges here. We had to, you know, unload the equipment and pass it along to each other. We had to bang in nails, get everything set up just right, and everything dangling from your ropes. So we started off actually doing these sonic measurements, and here you see Steve in the background, and he did the first set of taps. When he was done, he would pass the hammer over to me. And now I'm on the other side of the tree, just past Lotar's perch, and I'm starting to do the tapping work here on the sensors. And when I was done, I passed it to Scott, and then he passed it back to Steve to finish off on the other side. You know, a couple of more logistical challenges, like this hammer. If you drop this hammer, it's going down, 50 meters. Or 150 feet, and it probably won't work too well down there. If you drop a nail or something that you're working with, unless you have it tied off, you're probably not only going to get it back, nor find it back when it hits the ground down there. And I was on 2 different rope systems. I had one permanent rope and then one rope for positioning. They call that a motion lanyard in the Redwood, but it's actually like a 60-foot long piece of rope. And then, as I said, when I got finished, I passed stuff along to Scott and so on. And so this is just looking back at the photographers. This was Jim Spickler, one of the research team, who's gone on to a career doing all kinds of interesting things with the Redwoods, and Nick taking the photographs. In this photograph actually was really kind of a special time while we were in the forest. It had been gloomy and raining for a couple of days. And you can you see these rays of sunlight coming through the forest, and they were not quite horizontal, but they were coming across on a low angle. And you can actually see almost a blue color to the background here. And when the sun came through, it just became sort of a magical moment. And everyone was on the radios, buzzing, talking to each other. Nick was talking to his assistant on the ground, telling him to get photographs of this. And what gave the coloring and the really fantastic aspect of this is that on the end of every needle in the forest around us is a tiny little drop of water because of the moist nature of the forest. And when the sun actually and the light rays came through, those little droplets of water changed the color of the light. So for about 45 minutes, everything stopped and we were just all in awe of what was going on around us. So that was the second day. We did a sonic tomography and electrical resistance tomography. And then we determined that we could only do one more. So the next one was at 100 meters off the ground at 300 feet. And we were really up in the canopy of the tree. You can see Scott here among the branches. We had to, again, get all the equipment and our engineer who'd never climbed before all the way up here. And one thing you can see interesting about the redwood sort of anatomy, you see a lot of branches up here, but considering this tree, and I didn't get to that, the estimate of the age of this tree was 1900 plus or minus 100. So let's say a 2,000-year-old tree. And over time, the superstructure of that tree has changed, where there were historically much larger branches. I'll show one or two of them. But as those give way, these are mostly the new branches that sprouted out. I know I'm taking quite a bit of time, so I'm going to kind of rush through. This is just all of the electrical resistance tomography setup. You can see just a sea of wires, and everything has to be exact and precise. And once we set the analysis in motion, we all had to sit still for quite some time while the electrical impulses went around the tree. And Steve, who is super energetic, likes to get things done and lots of it. This was probably the worst part of the experience for him, sitting still in the tree for about 40 minutes and doing essentially nothing. But it allowed for me to really take some time to get these, views from the top. So this is looking out over one of the tallest forests in the world. And you can see that actually this tree that's just off center left is actually even a little taller than the one we were in. And not far away, less than a kilometer away, is what's currently known as the tallest tree in the world. So this forest supports the giants. And you see a lot of interesting things. You saw up in the canopy, you see a lot of this Spanish moss hanging off the branches, again, because it's a moist environment. You can see that the leaves, or let's say the needles in the top of the canopy here, they're very thin, just almost like spikes. The anatomy of the needles changes significantly between the top of the tree, where water is hard to get up there, and the bottom of the tree, and also more light up here and more shade below. And then there was a big rain day, and most of the researchers went home. But Steve said to Steve and I, well, you're going to need to set some ropes up there for our our work later. So why don't you guys go and do that today? And that was kind of his wink at us, knowing that we really wanted to climb to the top of the tree. So here I am at the top of the tree, 110 meters tall. And there's Scott and I. We were just really, literally on top of the world. And a few views looking out. One interesting anecdote, we were all alone in the forest, and while we were standing up here, we heard a rumbling and then a gigantic crash, which could have been nothing but a tree falling over. And I can tell you, when you're 110 meters up in the sky on a tree and you hear one fall over, it definitely makes you think. Makes you think maybe I should get back down. And I mentioned some of these branches that were much bigger historically. So here in the center, you see the stub of an old historic branch that's been replaced by smaller branches. But on those old branches, this is where you really saw those types of aerial soils developing. And we see this bed of ferns, which again, we're mostly used to seeing ferns on the forest floor. And here they are up at 300 feet up in the sky. And a little more detail there. The canopy is rich in biology, in lichens, in liverworts, in ferns. When you start to really take the time, and this is what I kept telling myself and Scott to do, take the time, look at everything carefully, take lots of pictures, because we may not be there again. And just, again, looking out from this unique perspective, looking across the forest, you can see an old fire-scarred stem in the middle of this one, and the moss-covered trees. Just a wonderful place. And so I'm going to move it to the end for time purposes. So after all that work, Steve Sillett actually put a little paper together to summarize our work. So this is his graphic that he pulled together, but the images are the ones that we took. So you see the tree here, and you see on the right side, you see sonic tomography going from brown to blue, so higher speed brown. And on the left side, you see the scale for electrical resistance. And if we start at the base, if we start with sonic tomography, you know, the technology has some challenges working with something that big. But generally what you see is brownish wood circling around the outside. In the center, you see blue and violet indicating that sound wasn't traveling as well. And I mentioned at some point about the cave or the hole at the base of the tree, and it lined up very well with this area down on the bottom of the tree where you see blue and violet on the outside. When we look at the electrical impedance tomograph, what the electrical impedance can do is help better define areas where sound isn't moving well. So in the center on the sonic tomograph, we see sound isn't moving particularly well there. Why is that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, actually the center image of the electrical impedance with all red and blue on the outside is sort of the, let's say, what we would call the normal or the standard for this species. So the one at the bottom, what we see is we see blue around the outside where it's moisture rich in the vessels. Then we see the red area, which is dry or solid wood. And in the center, we see blue again. So what that tells us is that likely in the center, it's not a cavity, it's some form of earlier decay, and the early decaying wood is holding a lot of moisture, so there's high conductance and low resistance here. When we move up to the middle level at 150 feet or 50 meters off the ground, we see that the sonic tomograph image showed some solid wood, but then really some sort of strange, or not strange, but unexpected to see so many areas of low speed. If we go over to the electrical impedance, what we see is actually the standard that we would expect. Once again, blue around the outside and red across the interior. And so while the sonic waves may have had trouble getting in here, the electrical impulses did, and they show us that actually the tree's quite solid at that level. And then when we got up to the very top of the tree, we see again that the sonic tomography was having trouble, let's say, generating a full image, and there's some areas of slow conduct. And once again, on the left side, we see blue on the outside, a ring of red, and then at the top of the image, we see that dark blue area. And if you remember from the pictures at the top of the tree was actually dead at the top. It had probably snapped off either in a windstorm or a lightning strike. And we figured that that blue area in the center was the column of decay extending down into the tree. Last little thing, one of the ways to explain the not so great sonic tomograph images at maybe in all cases, but certainly at the top, we looked around, and those of you who are foresters might know something called ring shake. So this yellow line on the top left traces out a crack that actually comes between the year rings of the tree. It also shows under the bark here, you can see there's actually a ram's horn inclusion in here. So sometimes there's things hiding under the bark, and these cracks are particularly difficult because sound can't jump over these. And so oftentimes cracks, and there's another one here, can confound the sonic tomography image. And I think it just brings forward again the value of doing both sonic and electrical resistance tomography, because an image like this, which may not be particularly clear, much more clarity can be brought with this electrical resistance. So thank you very much for your patience, and I'm going to turn it over back to John.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip, for making everybody feel rubbish about their holidays. That's an awesome trip. It's also provoked one of my favorite niche comments we've had in the chat, which is from Ian. The middle scan is one of the best type 2 EITs I've seen.
There you go. Well, John, it wasn't a holiday. It was work.
Of course it was. Sorry, I forgot the code then of people who do work trips. It was all work. I should say, we don't normally give this warning, but I should say don't try this at home, not just climbing enormous trees, but also a couple of people have said about the care and thought that needs to be taken before you drill holes or tap anything into any ancient trees in the UK. So consult an expert. Think about it carefully first. Don't try this at home. Let's put that disclaimer on it. Okay. Lots of stuff in the chat, as ever. All panelists and attendees, please, and then everybody can see what you're saying. Carry on putting in your great questions. But first of all, before we get to the Q&A session, thank you, Philip. Great presentation. And now over to Andy. Andy, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. It's a bit unexpected. And I hope I don't scare too many people off. Of course, it's difficult now after Philip's presentation. Mine is much less sexy pictures and much more things that I think are of technical nature. And Philip, I'm glad you left all this to me. I'm not speaking too much about tomography because Stefan, who is unfortunately sick today, is really the expert. I work with tomography a lot as an arborist, as a consulting arborist. And so I'm also happy to try and answer some of the questions that I saw in the Q&A section already. The presentation that I pulled from the drawer when I was asked to present tonight was originally held at a conference in Singapore, also a web conference on wind and tree interaction. And they asked me to give a perspective of a consulting practical arborist on how important wind and tree interaction, or understanding wind and tree interaction, is for us in our industry. So I'm focusing in my presentation more on what do we do with tomography pictures as an example of an advanced method to assess tree risk. And I'm also touching on other methods a little bit. Generally, for tree risk assessment, this is one of the slides that I put in for all these scientists in Singapore. You know these kind of things as practical arborists and consultants. We have a lot of guidelines around the world. These are some international ones. There's the British one that I have been in contact with, and our German standard for tree inspections. So there's a variety of regulations and guidelines, I would call that. But still, the focus today for me is on something like tomography. So using instruments, using devices, device-based inspections. The vast majority in our practice is consulted merely visually. And that's, I think, is an important thing to remember. But as we talk about the advanced methods, there are lots of things that we can also take home for our visual assessment if we understand more about things that we can learn from using tools for diagnosis and how things are then evaluated to really assess tree risk, or the likelihood of failure, I should say, in that case, which is what we focus on. There's a lot of things that you can also do in visual assessment just the same. So here is how we, in our family, that's my now 2.5-year-old daughter. She's following my footsteps already, hammering old veteran trees as a hobby. But this is a layout for me for the basis of understanding the likelihood of failure of trees, and also especially managing trees, because there are several elements that are important in this assessment when you do that. If you do it visually or if you do it with tools, it comes back to the same, I think, starting with the tree biology, which is important to understand the ability of a tree to compartmentalize defects and also compensate for defects by growing, which is basically the only technique that trees have to deal with problems. They grow. well, in medicine, you say also the liver grows with the problems, but the trees don't have other solutions. So they grow and they try with their entire potential biologically to stop defects and compensate for them by growing, usually in diameter rather than in height. And then we have the pathogens. And of course, there are lots of pathogens that the trees have to deal with. But for the risk assessment or assessing likelihood of failure, the wood decaying fungi are the ones, and how they spread within the wooden body. Understanding this is a clue for making good judgments about trees and their stability. And then tree biomechanics, which is what we usually use our instruments on, like the tomograph, to understand how strong the tree is on the one side. And on the other side, there should be an understanding how much load these trees are really exposed to. Because if you only know how strong a structure is, that doesn't really help you. A bridge can be very strong and then it's only used for pedestrians. Then, of course, it's a very, very safe tree. But on the other hand, if it's only pedestrians using that bridge, you don't need big concrete blocks that you use for lorries and motorways and stuff like that. So knowing the load that a structure is exposed to is important if you want to assess the likelihood of failure and not just the strength. Well, this is something that we now have to keep in mind when we run through a number of diagnostic tools. I looked a little bit at the chat and the Q&A section, and there was already questions with regard to increment core drills or drill resistance measurements. You're all familiar with this, so I can just flip over that. Just to come back to a comment that I saw by Neville Fay, there is actually a scientific study that was done in Germany already in 2005 that clearly showed that drill channels in the sound wood are being used by fungi to spread from decay columns through former compartmentalization zones into the sound wood. And you can talk about it, of course, if that's a bad thing or if it's something that happens anyway, but it is a channel for spreading fungal decay. And this picture was done by colleagues in the Czech Republic, and it was an increment core drill that caused this infection to spread. I'm not saying that's why this is the reason the tree failed, okay? But it's just to show the effect that can occur. The second problem that is, from my point of view, is maybe even more difficult to deal with is that if you have irregular sections, then one drill doesn't give you sufficient information. And that is the difference to tomography. Tomography, the goal is to give a picture of the position of sound wood within a cross section. Let's put it like this, or a rough position of sound wood within a cross section. And we know that these hollow trees don't usually have a concentrical shape. It's not round, and there's not a wall of the same diameter all over the circumference. So if you were to carry out a drill, an increment core drill or resistance core drill, and you would do that at one point, not knowing the other ones leaves you with a big level of uncertainty of what this section really looks like. So in order to understand how strong this cross section is, you have to have several points where you can measure the residual wall. It is definitely a big difference between these three sections, and that's just basic mechanics and not rocket science that is behind this. Sonic tomography, that was covered by Philip very much. So the only thing that I would like to add is that we have the problems that were mentioned with cracks because they inhibit the sound, and they are barriers for the sound. If we have decay, the distance that the sound has to cover changes. It's a little bit like we are focusing very much on this very exact measurement of the velocity. So it's a very precise measurement down to nanoseconds. Lothar is online, he can correct me, but it's a very exact measurement of the time of flight. On the other hand, to calculate the apparent velocity, you also need to know the distance that the sound has to cover. If you are not measuring the distance well, then you can make quite big errors. And I think this is clearly understandable for everybody. If you are a sprinter in the Olympics and the timer takes your time down to the 10th of or 100th of a second, you want to make sure that your competitors have to cover the same distance, won't you? I mean, it doesn't help to measure the time that the three sprinters take to arrive at the goal if you don't know that each of them has to run 100 meters. So this is very important to get a good picture and generate a reliable picture. And I'm calling it a picture because it is nothing but a picture. It's not the reality. It's something that can give us an idea of the distribution of sound wood, and we can use biomechanics to assess the strength of this section against bending or torsion or whatever we want. But it is not the reality necessarily. Now, there is research on how well sonic tomography can picture the distribution of sound wood, and it's surprisingly good. According to a study that was done in the US, I think Lothar pointed out the link to a presentation where that was already where that is covered. And if you are interested in that, you should have a look at that presentation. That was a webinar by the Tree Fund. I don't want to cover the electric resistance tomography too much. It is a completely different system, a completely different principle that you measure with, and combining the two, that's what Philip already pointed out, is really helpful because you get different analysis tools on the same section. But what you end up with, again, no matter what you do, whether you drill, let's say 3 or 4 resistance drill holes, or take increments in 3 or 4 or maybe 5 different locations, or if you do electric impedance on the left or sonic tomography on the right, you get a picture that mirrors the distribution of sound wood. And all you can do now is to try and assess how strong this section is using basically biomechanics. This is a study done by Daniel Burcham in Singapore, where he developed what he calls Z-loss, which is nothing else but calculating the strength loss in different directions based on moment of inertia. I don't want to go too much into that detail. This is a publication by Frank Grinn, where he, with the Arbotome, also calculates the strength loss based on the moment of inertia. So there are other formulas as well. This is just 2 that I picked out. And then there are several thresholds that are being used currently to assess whether a certain amount of strength loss is critical for a tree or is not critical. You're all familiar with the T/R ratio of 1/3. This is one of the publications that this is based on, and here is a graph from a paper by Brian Kane and others that also comes up with an overview of several approaches to assess a hazard tree based on a strength loss threshold. And usually, if you have a strength loss that is exceeding a certain limit, this is 30% strength loss, then usually trees are seen as critical trees. And I would like to point out a little bit that here it is important to think about, is such a uniform strength loss threshold really applicable? There has been a lot of discussion on that. I'm trying to point out why in our practice we always use an estimation of the wind load that the tree is exposed to as well, and not just the uniform strength loss threshold. And I've got many colleagues in Germany at least who also are still working from a strength loss threshold like the T over R ratio in the VTA method, but then they try to make amendments. They try to change it according to site conditions and tree site. You've got these two trees, and obviously the one tree on the left is a sheltered tree. Buildings are covering it against wind. It has a narrow crown and a slender stem, and the other tree is a big tree in a rather low built environment. It towers above the houses. So they're completely different, differently exposed to wind. Of course, they also have different sizes of the stem. And this is the next part that is a problem of a uniform strength threshold and trying to deal without a wind load analysis. I mean, this is the rationale often is that wind load estimations for trees are something that you just cannot do. It's something that is irrational. It's airing too much, and you never know how to estimate the wind load. So you rather don't do it, and you try to do without. That is what makes a uniform strength loss threshold so interesting, because you just can forget about wind load assessment. You just apply it to all the trees the same. The shortcomings, first, site conditions and tree size. And then there's another aspect where you try to change the strength loss threshold by the age of the tree or by the size of the tree. And these considerations usually start by saying this is an optimum tree, so to say. A diameter of X centimeters is the optimum for a certain size of the crown and a certain tree species. And then if the tree is bigger, then it can deal with more strength loss. That is, generally speaking, the right direction. That is also what we try to do. The problem is that there is no self-optimized reference strength. Trees can't stop to grow in diameter, only if you girdle them. For example, in Canopy walks or in adventure parks, you do that. Then you stop them from growing in diameter. But trees at a certain age, they will stop to grow in height, usually at a certain age. That is finished. But every year they grow in diameter. So there is no other way for a tree, as it becomes older, that there will be an increase in stem diameter, and therefore there is a response. There is a surplus in strength. The second thing is that trees also grow to wound response or to increase the hydraulic capacity. So there are several stimuli for growth in diameter, and it's not really feasible to just determine a certain point where the tree is 100% strength, and you should not neglect the surplus in strength that especially ancient trees, older trees, have developed in their lifetime. This surplus in strength is particularly dominant, particularly visibly if you think about the diameter of the stem. If we compare those two trees, the one on the right has twice the diameter of the one than the one on the left side. And now we apply our strength loss threshold 30%. We can basically convert this into a decay column inside of the tree. And now this is the same strength loss for both trees. So if we apply the strength loss threshold of 30%, both trees have the same likelihood of failure, so to say. But initially, before the decay started, the tree on the right, with twice the diameter, has 8 times what we call the basic safety. It's 8 times stronger than the one on the left side, just by doubling the diameter. Now, this is, in a way, the reference point that you have to consider when you talk about strength loss. Strength loss is okay, but you have to know from what amount of strength have you lost 30%. And if you're losing 30% of your money in your bank account, that's a bad thing. And if you only have £1,000 or euros or whatever on your bank account, you lose 30%. That for you is probably really a bad thing. If somebody like the owner of Amazon loses 30% of his money, I'm not telling his name, that's still a lot of money for him to lose, but he's still a very rich person. Somebody who doesn't have a lot of money loses 30%, he's living in poverty. Somebody who's very rich to start from, losing 30%, is still among the richest persons in the world. So strength loss as a relative measure doesn't tell you anything about the actual status of the tree. Is it still safe enough? Because it started from a very high basic safety and has lost 30% and still is a very safe tree, or was it working on its limits and losing 30% turns it into a really hazardous tree? This is just from work that we've done, from wind load analysis, from basically static load tests on trees done with the software, where you can see how this basic safety factor increases with stem diameter. Stem diameter is on the base, and you can see the bigger the diameter, the bigger this basic safety factor, and the tree height, of course, also has an effect. But generally speaking, by growing in diameter, trees accumulate a surplus in strength that they can use to deal with the defects that they experience. They can pre-compensate, so to say. It's already compensated for before the decay reduces the strength. These approaches with the basic safety help you to analyze tomograms pretty well, and there's software, there's methods like the SIA method, or this is TreeCalc, a software where you can do calculations, and you can then look at different cross sections, compare it to your tomogram, and see how much the basic safety factor of the tree is being used up by the strength loss, and whether it's then still a safe tree or not any longer. If you want to try that out, you just have to register, and with this code you get 5 free calculations to try the system out if you like, and there's a reference at the base of this slide. The engineering approach behind this is something that scares people off quite frequently, because you have to calculate, you have to think about units and stuff like that. The software helps you to not having to deal with that, but you have to have this basic understanding that on one side, you've got the strength of the tree determined, for example, by the stem diameter, but also the wood quality. All this comes into play when you want to assess a tree like this. The strength of the root system cannot be assessed simply. This has to be done by more complicated methods or more sophisticated methods like the static load test or the monitoring of trees in natural winds. And on the other side, you have to compare this strength to the expected peak load. And as time is already running, I can see that I'm talking for more than 20 minutes, but the time is already 7:15 your time. So I'm trying to speed up a little bit. The pulling test method, I mentioned this. Pulling test method cannot be applied without a wind load assessment at all, because what you measure in a pulling test is the response of a tree to a specific artificial load in terms of strain, elongation or compression of fibers in the stem, and rotation or change in inclination of the stem base. And this is always correlated to the force that you applied. So you don't get a picture, you don't get a centimeter, a residual wall or anything. You just get change in length per force unit or change in angle per force unit. If you deliver that to your client, can't do anything with it. With a tomogram, he can look at it and say, oh, that's really hollow. It's another approach, because in this case, you do very exact measurements on the tree and you try to find out how it responds to a load. So it's in a way a direct measurement of the tree responding to a load. It's not the same as wind because this is a static load, but we have means to correlate this static test to dynamic wind loads, and I hope I have enough time to touch on that. Maybe we need another webinar for that. So just quickly, the instruments we're using, the elastometer measures the strain in the fibers in the periphery, and it's enough to measure on the outside because here we will always experience the peak strains, and we measure with an accuracy of 1/1000th of a millimeter, and the resolution is even 1 magnitude greater, so 0.1 micrometer is the resolution. So very small changes in length can be displayed by this sensor. And for the inclination, we use inclinometers. They are attached at the base of the trunk, so we can pick up what the root system does. And as we are loading the tree, there will be a change in the inclination of the stem, a very small one. You cannot see it because we will stop this test before any damages occur. And in the case of the inclinometer measurements, we stop at 1/4 of a degree inclination. And there are by now several scientific studies out there that have shown that if you do not change the inclination of the stem base by more than 0.5 degrees actually, so we're stopping at half of that, there's no irreversible, no permanent damage to the root system. And this is quite profoundly known now that the pulling test method does not damage roots. Of course, I've seen people performing this test, pulling trees to 1 degree or 1.5 degrees, even uprooting the tree in a test. So this method is not something that you should try at home, just like Sean said. You need to have training on that. You have to have very good equipment. You have to be able to place these sensors in the positions where they really measure what you want to measure. Otherwise, since you're actually exerting high forces on the trees, you may very well damage a tree. But in the controlled manner that arboricultural experts are using this method, we can really be sure that it's non-destructive for the tree. The wind load assessment can be done by several software programs. This is Arbostat that we are using, and they follow the procedures detailed in our Eurocode, or I was not supposed to mention the Brexit, right? No, of course. Anyway, sorry. In our there are international standards for wind load assessment. This case, the Eurocode is what is the basis for that. And here we've got specific guidelines how to assess the wind load on oscillating structures. So it's important that the software that you're using is based on that procedure and not on the simple procedures that you can use for houses, industry buildings, office buildings, structures that are usually not starting to oscillate. I don't know about Britain, but here in our region, they're usually quite stable. But on the base here in the slide, you see this kind of structure that the regulations are set out for. This is a structure on a stick, and this is how we simulate a tree in these methods. This is how the wind speed is used. There are different regions. This is Germany, by the way. The same exists for Britain and other countries in the world. And here we can get statistically based reference wind speeds that you can use to assess a typical event that you should expect during the lifetime of a tree. These storms have been recorded in some cases for more than 100 years to get a statistical basis for how often strong winds will occur and what is a suitable reference. Because of course, if you want to have a tree that's absolutely storm-proof, the highest wind speed that you could imagine is your reference point to assess if the tree is likely to fail. If you do that, then all the trees have to be felled, because these highest wind speeds that may occur in typhoons or in hurricanes, there's hardly any tree that will survive that. Maybe it survived, but it will only be a stem and no branches anymore. So it doesn't make sense to take the highest wind speed. You need an event that can be used as a reference. And usually in that case, you may refer to Beaufort 12 storms. And there was a question posed in advance already. If we use Beaufort 12, this is the gust wind speed that is defined as Beaufort 12. Usually that's 117 or 118 kilometers per hour, or Beaufort 12 scale gust wind speed. So there's a small misunderstanding with this Beaufort scale because it refers to events. But typically, if there's a weather forecast for the weekend, it may say, oh, in the weekend we get a big storm, Beaufort 9, and in gusts it will go up to Beaufort 11. So this is what we refer to gusts of Beaufort 12. We have to make adaptations for trees because the guidelines, the technical standards like the Eurocode, they are designed for structures like towers and basically structures sticking out of their environment. If the trees are set in an urban location, they are usually within this, what we call a rough layer, within the built environment and just slightly sticking out maybe. So there are changes due to what we call tunnel effects or blast pipe effects. There are standards that we can use to simulate the dynamic response of a tree to wind as it is exerted. It's exposed to turbulent winds with gusts hitting it at frequencies at certain intervals. And this is something that I don't want to go into detail now, but this is how it basically works. We are looking at a mean wind profile, so mean wind speed, and then we've got gusts. The wind accelerates and sometimes it's less wind. This is the second graph here. And then it hits the structure, in our case, the tree. And if the tree is very likely to oscillate, it may start to go back and forth like a pendulum. Actually, it's not a pendulum. Please forget the pendulum. But this is the model that we're still using. It's starting to resonate is the technical term. And due to this response, there will be a maximum deflection. It's like if you take a snapshot exactly at the moment where the tree is at rest and starts to go backwards again. Just before it goes backwards, it's in its maximum deflection. And this is what we model according to these guidelines in the technical standards. What will be the maximum response of a tree to a sequence of gusts? And then basically, you can also pull the tree to that position with a static force. And that's why we talk about a static equivalent wind load, because it is the static load that would cause the same maximum deflection as a sequence of gust would do. And if you have a tree like this, a typical urban tree with a high life-crown ratio, it's very likely to start to oscillate in the wind and amplify its deflections due to resonance. Of course, this is an area where many people feel not really comfortable with. I don't feel comfortable if you don't consider the wind load at all, because then you're judging trees the same, despite the fact that they have adapted to completely different wind environments. So at least we have to make an attempt to assess that. And if you are willing to use kind of an engineering tool like the SIA method or TreeStat, or if you do wind load estimations based on Eurocode guidelines, that doesn't matter, but I'll really urge you to try and put the exposure to wind into your considerations when you think about the likelihood of failure of trees. And I'm probably everybody of you is already doing that. It's just the problem is how to do it correctly. And there are still things that arborists may have to learn. And there's even ongoing research on some of these things, like if trees are not standing alone, but in groups or in avenues, they will share the wind load among each other. We know that the wind resistance changes with different crown structures. For example, after strong reduction pruning, you're making the crown much stiffer, but on the same time, the amount of foliage and branches is reduced a lot. So these things are sometimes counteracting effects that we don't have exact means to estimate. And this is where the engineer comes in. It's not a scientific method, but you have to find a way to consider this, being on the safe side and aware of the errors that you can make. But if you don't do it at all, your error is the greatest that you can make. There is effects of the built environment that I touched on, and we know that trees are able to use their structure and their mass and their leaves to reduce the amount of energy they have to dissipate into the stem. Let me just quickly touch on that before I finish. And this is about tests that we are conducting with the association SAG Baumstatik or Tree Statics. It's an international association which originated in Germany. That's why it still has a German name. And here we are putting trees into a wind tunnel and checking the difference of the wind load they experience, whether they're alone or whether they are, like in this case, in a group of 6 trees. We know that the wind resistance changes with the wind speed, and trees are adapting to the wind. There's also ongoing research internationally to find out more about this. There is a lot of research going on about the exposure of trees to wind in urban areas, specifically by computer-aided fluid mechanics. This is computational methods where you can mimic what a wind tunnel would do in the computer. And they come up with maps like this. I just found this today from a study. It's the city of Essen in Germany. And they have a 3D map of the built environment. And then they can identify these red regions are regions where wind speed is increased. And the green regions are the ones where the wind speed is reduced. Now, if your tree is located exactly in one of those red areas, it will experience much greater wind loads than the ones in the green area. And this is all what I'm trying to tell you. It's important to make a difference between those 2 trees, the one in the red area and the one in the green area. In Asia, there's research where they even now are able to identify for every tree in the inventory in the city what the wind exposure is based on these computer-aided fluid mechanic models. The dynamics can be studied. This is how Ken James originally did this setup with elastometers. I'll try not to focus too much on that now because we are already running out of time. But what you can see in this graph on the left side is basically the trace of a tree in the wind. The red one is the one on the right side. The blue one is the spruce tree on the left side in the picture. And it's like a trace of the movement in the wind. And you can see it's not blown from the 0 point to the maximum deflection, but it is actually just trying to draw this here for you if it's possible. No, I cannot do this here. I'm sorry, I'm too stupid. I thought I could do it. Anyway, this maximum point here where it is all the way up, so to say, which is backwards in our case, you get to this point not in one straight line, but in a series of loops. It's like the tree is going a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. And now there is a new model where you can do this without having to think about resonance and a pendulum. You can do this in a model that is called a stick-slip mechanism. So the idea is actually the tree is caught by the wind and pushed with the wind until the tree is bent enough to generate a force that is restoring its original position. It's pushing backwards against the wind. And then it goes a little bit backwards, and the next wind takes it along even more until it has enough restoring force, and it slips again a little bit against the wind, and then the wind pushes it and takes it along. So it's this stick and slip mechanism. And this type of behavior that you see in this picture is perfectly modeled with this stick-slip mechanism by a German professor called Dirk Schindler and his colleagues. It's a very interesting new model that is, from my understanding, the way we should look at dynamics in trees in the future. Just to finish up, 1 minute. Think about wind loading of a tree, not so much in terms of forces. Forces is what we can handle. It's like forces is gravity. We know how heavy things are. We know how hard we have to push something. This is all forces. But actually wind is a form of energy. It's packets of air at a certain speed. So this is energy being transferred into the tree. And the tree absorbs this energy and forces are being generated on the tree. The branches are being pushed along the wind because as they take up the energy, these forces are generated and move them basically. But as the branches are moving, they are able to dissipate some of this energy that the wind actually brought into the tree. So the input, the amount of energy that we have as an input into the tree is absorbed, but not fully dissipated down into the trunk, but it's giving back into the wind by the branches swaying back and forth. You know the mass damping model maybe by Ken James, and here's is more recent research on the fluttering of branches and leaves. This dissipates parts of the energy, and basically just as a funnel, like a filter in the end at the base of the stem or in the root system, it generates strains, deformations, and rotation of the root plate. And these strains and rotations, they in itself are able to dampen some of the energy. They can reduce the energy. This is a study that we did by inclining the root system more and more, and you can see how much energy can be dissipated as the roots are moving in the soil. So the tree has a lot of means to dissipate the energy. To finish up, if we measure the tree motion in natural winds, this is a TMS sensor based on the stem base, we are able to actually monitor the behavior of a real tree in real wind. This, of course, is excellent. But usually when I'm called in on a construction site where the roots have been cut, for example, on a tree, it's not convincing for my client if I tell them I can really measure if the tree is still strong enough or if it's a hazard, but we have to wait for the next storm. They usually tell me that I can do myself. So we need the static load test for the immediate answer, whether the tree is still stable or not, just as we could use tomography to immediately assess the strength of a stem, but we can use these motion sensors in natural wind to generate better data on how the tree is really exposed to wind, how the sheltering effects really work on the tree, and what kind of response it really will produce as the wind is hitting this tree. You need a certain storm to do that reliably, and you need to wait for the next storm. This is disadvantage. But we use this technology to calibrate our wind load assessments done with with the software. This is just 4 trees, but it was surprisingly good. So the margin of error is actually very low for these wind load estimations. But somebody has to do it who has experience with assessing the parameters that are involved, and therefore this is basically a call for more training, better understanding, and that's why you're here. That's why I have attended this webinar, and thank you very much for following me through this. I don't know how many people have left already, but I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Well, some people always leave, but it's not a reflection on you. We've got just under 400 people still watching, which is pretty amazing, really. Philip, can I summon you back? Oh, look at that, as if by magic. There he is. Andy, that was brilliant. Philip, that was brilliant. Just really great stuff, and a lot of love going on in the chat. We've got loads of questions. I always say we're not going to have time to get through them all, and we're definitely not tonight, but all the question and answer, not the answers, they know the answers, all the questions and the chat will be sent to Philip and Andy afterwards, and they'll be able to engage with them then, should they wish. So let's rattle through. I've picked out a few that I like. A question for Philip, first of all, which I'm immediately going to lose. Right, question from Mirko in Slovenia. Hi, Mirko. Mirko says, arboricultural expeditions are an astonishing union of science and adventure. What are your recommendations for young arborists and scientists to get involved in the big canopy research? And I think, just to preempt slightly, something you said at the beginning was quite inspirational, which is for you just went and asked.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I have a lot of pearls of wisdom other than that. I think for me, there was a lot of serendipity. I think if it just hadn't happened that I met Steve and we started talking about tomography, then my wishes probably would have been ignored. But it was just the happy marriage of what I was involved in, what I could offer. So maybe that's part of it. I mean, first of it is identify where that research might be going on at all. Secondly, if you have the academic chops, approach those professors and see whether you could do some kind of a research project, a master's or a PhD. That gives you lots of time doing it. But otherwise, I think just, looking for those places, being bold. Don't say it can't happen, just go for it and try and make it happen. One other thing I would mention, kind of related, but not exactly. There's been, over in the USA, there's been a series of events called Tree Biomechanics Week. And that's where we had identified a site where we could actually destroy trees for science. And on several of those occasions, there were there was an opportunity for people to apply to come and be a research assistant. So, that's a kind of an event where if you volunteer your time, you would maybe meet some of the people that might be involved in the work that you're interested in. I think that's what I could give.
Thanks, Philip. Sounds like good advice to me. And also just being on these kind of events, there's some amazing people contributing to the chat, just say hello, ask them some questions, let's use these opportunities. Right, Andy, a question for you. Normally I just kind of go through slightly randomly, and I've taken notes today, so I've completely thrown myself. Andy, Ian is asking, to what extent ground condition comes into the risk assessment when you're looking at the wind and everything?
Yeah, basically that's an excellent question. It's hard to cover that in detail. When we perform pulling tests, the ground condition is usually not important unless the ground is frozen, of course, because then we get completely wrong results. In the beginning of this method in the 80s, they always water saturated the soil before they pulled the tree for the test to have a worst case. We've done several studies by now, and especially on urban trees, changing the moisture content to a water saturated state did not change the results of the pulling test to a big amount. It was significantly different, and with higher moisture, you get more inclination with the same force, but the differences were so small that this is not necessarily a procedure that we prescribe to always water saturate the soil, because we always have to have a safety factor, a desired safety factor, something like a design factor that makes sure that all the errors that we are potentially making are not leading to a result where the tree is left in place, but it is a hazard tree. So we are looking at the different effects, like, for example, soil moisture, or different soils, whether they change the result to a degree that is not covered by the safety factor. And so far, and I have to say so far because we haven't tested all the trees in the world, so far we have not identified many critical situations. One situation that I can mention is water-saturated soils that have fallen dry. We tested trees that are usually on a water-saturated soil, but due to the drought, the water table had fallen by 90 centimeters. And there, our assessment was slightly overestimating how strong they are. So they were a little bit weaker than we thought they would be. That is an example where we try to gain knowledge with research to improve the accuracy of these estimations, but we will never get 100% exact, and that's not the goal. We have to know our margins of error and cover that with a kind of a design factor.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, very, very sensible answer, I think. Okay, we're just going to jump all over the place with these questions. Sorry, we're jumping from technical stuff to non-technical stuff. But Philip, we've had a couple of people in the chat and a couple of questions, I suppose, expressing concern about the nails going into the trees and through the bark. And some of that's been addressed in the chat. But Anne has asked, don't the nails damage the tree? And sort of connected, Jackie has asked, do you have longer nails for thicker bark? And does that damage the tree as well?
Okay, so one of the really important things is with sonic tomography is you have to have the sensors in the wood. They can't be in the bark because that has completely different sound propagating properties than the wood. So to date, we have not figured out a better way. All of the tomographs somehow or other put something into the wood so that we can generate a sound. So I've never described tomography as non-invasive. I describe it as minimally invasive. And I think, because people say, well, if you're going to do invasive, why not just drill the tree? The difference is, from my perspective, if you tap a nail, a point of a nail, a centimeter or something into the wood, you're in the most vigorous, healthy part of the tree, able to mount defense reactions, etc. And it's really a minimal, if you go into any urban situation, you'll find metal pounded into trees everywhere, and they don't just have a big problem with it. So the opposite, though, and one of the reasons for the tomograph development is if you do drill, and Andy mentioned this, and I will just reiterate it, if you drill, if any of the people on the call have read Al Shigo and Code It model or Dirk Duyevskin, basically the tree sets up one of its most important reactions to decay by defending the solid wood. So if we drill with a resistograph, especially with an increment core, there is the possibility, and not the likelihood, but the possibility that, let's face it, if you're drilling and you're not doing any kind of pre-calculation of how far you want to go or should go into the tree, you're doing what I like to call the Voyage of Discovery. And most people keep drilling until they find a change in the resistance. When they find that change of the resistance, they've taken the drill and breached the primary defense of the tree because they're looking for decay. If they get into the middle, well, that's where the fungal activity is, where spores, mycelia are, and you open that hole and it's full of air and you invite the decay into the solid wood. So that's the problem with an alternative. And I would say, reiterate, putting the nails in the tree is still somewhat invasive, but it's minimally invasive, and the tree has a definite opportunity to react to that incursion, let's say.
Thanks, Philip. Hopefully that answers a few of the questions and comments, and quite understandable concern, I think, that we've had in the chat. That's great. Andy, what was I going to ask you? Question from Anthony. Hi, Anthony. As ever, good questions coming in. Anthony asks if you could please explain the counterintuitive suggestion that pruning can increase wind loading by the increase in stiffness of remaining branches and the loss of streamlining from flexible stems and foliage and from mass damping. I know you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but when I started out in tree management, if you wanted to reduce the impact of the wind, you reduced the crown. It was really easy, and that's not the case, is it?
Thank you for the opportunity to come back to that, because I did not want to say that the wind load was increased by reducing a tree crown. This is counterintuitive, and this is also counter all research results that I'm aware of. I know that there are some people talking about a secret study that shows that. This study has never been published. It had never been validated. It has never been seen by anybody that I know. So all the studies that I know and that have been published and peer reviewed, they show a reduction in the wind load as you reduce a tree crown in height. The point that I was trying to make is that as you are reducing the crown, the periphery of the crown is the most flexible part in a way, but it is also usually the most densest part of the crown, where most of the foliage and twigs are. So energy absorption, if the wind energy is absorbed by the tree, the primary point of entry, so to say, is the periphery of the crown. And that is going to deflect a lot, that is going to dissipate a lot of energy, but that's also causing a lot of friction with the wind. If you are generating the same dense periphery, but on a more stiff substructure, for example, like if you're pruning a tree really hard and it starts to regrow, it starts to grow again new shoots, and it forms a dense new canopy, but that canopy will be less flexible than it was before. So you may have a greater drag factor, so you may have more energy absorption in a way, but still the crown is much smaller. So the total amount of energy absorption, the total forces that will actually arrive at the stem and at the base and the root system is reduced. And then there's the second rumor out that because you're changing the damping and the natural frequency, so the sway properties of the tree, you may increase the wind load by reducing it. Again, it's the same thing. It's true that due to resonance factors, if there's little damping, you have removed a lot of branches. So you're leaving the tree after the reduction with less damping and maybe a change in the sway properties. But the input that you have, the energy input, is reduced a lot because you reduce the size so much. So your input is maybe only half, and then there's a slight increase, a slight amplification due to the change in the dynamics. So you don't have half the wind load, but maybe 60%. But the reduction effect will be there. And you have to change actually a lot in the crown before you change the dynamics. The only thing I was referring to is that when we are doing this kind of considerations to the wind load, there are many things we should consider, and it's also important to understand how things interact, like reduction pruning, changing the overall input of energy into the tree, but it may also change something in the way this energy is absorbed, but not necessarily increasing the wind load. And I'd like to say it again, it's not only counterintuitive, it's also counter-scientific.
Thank you, Andy. I think that's going to be very interesting to a lot of people. I think that's another one we could probably have a whole webinar on really discussing, because there's so much misinformation out there. But it can go on the list, the massive ever-growing list of webinar topics we need to address. Right, Philip, I've got a question for you, but before I offer you the question, I wanted to raise something that Mark has just said, because I noted this down as a question I wanted to ask. about biosecurity when you're using tomography. And Mark said, don't forget biosecurity is also vital when tapping in nails for the tomograph or microdrilling with a resi needle, not to transfer any nasties to your next tree or from the previous one. And the question I was going to ask is, to what extent is biosecurity thought of? Is it a regular thing to disinfect all the pins and the nails?
Well, I wouldn't say it's something we do every time. It's certainly a good consideration. I would say that, mostly we don't use very specialized nail. We did in the Redwood, for example, but generally we're using pretty common nails, and we tend to, they bend or whatever, and we discard them and use another one. So I think it's definitely a good consideration, and we do, like, if we are working on a tree where we definitely know that there's pathogens involved, then we would discard the nails afterwards. But we're on the outside of the tree most of the time, so we're not getting into the area where the spores of the fungus would generally be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip. We normally wrap up about now, but we've got more than 300 people watching, and I feel like I'm just going to keep pressing on until lots of you disappear, because we're going to keep working through questions. So apologies to Andy and Philip. We're just going to crack on. Okay, so Philip, that wasn't actually your proper question. That was just a little supplementary one. The proper question I was going to ask you, Martin and Moray have both asked essentially the same question. Martin said, could you provide an opinion on the pros and cons of sonic versus electrical tomography, and when and why one might be selected to the other? And Moray's asked the same question essentially, which is more accurate, sonic or electrical resistance tomography? So this is a big can of worms, and there's lots of discussions going on about it, but in a short summary, first Philip, and then I'll ask you as well, Andy.
Okay, I guess it is an interesting subject. I would say, our protocol has always been to do the sonic tomography first, and we get an idea about how sound is traveling through. If we have a perfectly solid tree, we don't need to do the electrical resistance tomography. We follow up with the electrical resistance because when we do find areas of slow transmission, it can greatly help to define what's going on in the center there. And yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I might ask Andy's opinion on that. Our protocol generally in my consultancy has, mostly been doing sonic tomography first. One of the other things that I think is important in the discussion is, if you do a sonic tomograph, you are getting the relative sonic velocity across the plane that you're scanning. And it doesn't matter what tree you are on, what species you're on, it's only looking at the level that you're looking at. One of the perhaps challenges with only doing electrical resistance tomography is you don't have, you have to make sure that you understand where your species fits into those. As I mentioned, there are sort of at least three known sort of standard images that you might get from a perfectly healthy tree. So you need to be able to understand that the species that you're working in, what the baseline is that you're comparing it to. I think, Andy, maybe you want to add something to that?
Yeah,
yes, please.
In our practice, we have the same protocol. We use both devices because adding the electric impedance is just a couple of minutes. You've set it up and it's very quick to do the electric impedance once you have set up everything for the sonic tomography. And I personally like very much the information that I can imagine to see. The problem is with electric impedance, we've got less research on what the results really mean than we have with sonic tomography, and we've got a lot of other effects, side effects and distortions that you can get. For example, if you do electric impedance very close to the ground, the electricity may travel through the ground, leave the tree, travel through the moist ground and enter again. So you have to be aware of many things that can go wrong in a way. But we've had several cases where it was really important to also know the electric impedance tomogram to get to a good conclusion. And we are doing a little study where we are also looking at the sound wood, where sonic tomography just tells you plain wood, perfect. But very often we can see the wind direction from the electric impedance tomogram, because reaction growth, strong growth responds to a stimulus from, for example, wind from one direction, or a root that's well connected and it's sustaining the crown on a very old tree, gives you high electric impedance. As I have no explanation, these are just observations, and I think we will be able to learn a lot more in the future if there are more studies on things like that that give us a better understanding, especially of old trees. And at the moment, it is important to make sure that we're not erring by the artifacts that can be generated in the sonic tomogram, like what we had, ring shake and things like that. Therefore, we always use it.
Thanks, Andy. Sonia commented earlier on, there's so much we don't know about trees. And I think that's part of what's great about our industry. But whilst you're obviously teaching us a lot tonight, you're also demonstrating we've really got to do so much more as well. So it's very exciting. Okay, on to a question from Emma for Philip. Philip, Emma is asking whether Steve or anyone else has reported on the fungi present in the decay pockets you talked about high up in these redwoods, where they're accessible. And Emma's volunteering to go and have a look at the fungi for you.
Well, I'm going to have to probably say, Emma, you need to look up Steve Sillett and go through a plethora of his paper to find that information. I don't know exactly. One of the things I do know is that one of the features that contributes to the longevity of the redwoods is their resistance to decay. So there appears to be not that many species that can pierce the armor of a redwood, and it contributes to their longevity. But I'm going to be clear and honest. I'm not an expert on the physiology that would contribute to that. But I would venture to say that in Steve Sillett's work, there may be some commentary on that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip. Nice try, Emma, but you're not getting a trip out there just yet.
Well, she should call Steve and let him determine that, John. maybe there's a project in the waiting for Emma.
There probably is. I'll just be too jealous. That's the only reason I said that. But yeah, Emma, call Steve. Okay, this is another question possibly for both of you. I'll come to Andy first. It's in the chat from Neville. Normally we don't pick out questions from the chat because it confuses me, but it's worth mentioning this. Neville says, can you comment on your common professional home, SAG bound static? Neville says he thinks it would be helpful as few in the UK and beyond know about this technical expertise community established to bring knowledge and analysis of the structural condition of trees. So we'll go to Andy first and then Philip, but can you tell us just briefly a little bit about bound static?
Yes, this group is actually already rather old. It was founded in 1993 when I was still working as a tree. No, actually, I was in Scotland being a volunteer in the botanical garden. But this group has undergone some changes. It used to be something like the group of the people who work with Lothar Wessely and perform pulling tests according to the method that was developed in cooperation with Günther Sinn at Stuttgart. And this is how I became a member of this group. Today it's a little bit different. This group is a platform for all the arborists and consulting arborists that are aiming at a certain way of looking at trees and assessing trees. This is a bit where also the beginning of my presentation stems from. We have people who are biologists, mycologists, we have got engineers and climbing arborists, we've got people in the group that are experienced with the devices and the biomechanics, and others are specialized in visual assessment. So in a way, we try to bring together approaches where trees are being judged similarly to other structures, but with the special knowledge about their response to damages and their response to the loads that they're exposed to. It's a group that has the goal to deepen and spread knowledge about this approach to judging trees. So we're funding research. We're doing workshops that are open to the public. There's one coming up in February with speakers from around the world because it's a webinar. We're trying to make the best of the pandemic. Normally we have real life workshops where we invite a speaker. People like Hans-Christoph Spatz, Karl Niklas will be joining us later this year. Roloff has been presenting for us. So we're trying to invite speakers and have discussions with them. That's the main thing, what we do. We also try to establish standards for good working practice. And we are also trying to really initiate research, students' projects, or support researchers that work in this area of tree biomechanics and engineering approaches to trees. It's a group that currently has 40 members internationally from Canada, that's Philip, Neville and Paul and Claire in the UK, and Poland and the Czech Republic, Italy, Spain. So it's a small group, but a very lively group.
Thanks, Andy. Have you got anything to add to that, Philip?
Well, yeah, I guess it's a group that was originally sort of shrouded in mystery and high standards, if not impossible to penetrate from the outside, let's say. But as Andy said, it's evolved from there, and I was one of the first non-German folks to enter into there. And I can tell you it was a challenge at the beginning, entering into that world of biomechanics in a foreign language for me. But yeah, it's expanded, and I think Andy gave a good explanation of it. And I think it's a great place to learn more about the types of things that we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Philip.
But don't try and pronounce the name, though. Just call it SAG.
Hey, I have now murdered so many different names in so many different languages since we've done these webinars. I don't even feel ashamed about it anymore. I just you're lucky you're not Wassenaer.
Let's hear it then. Come on, SAG. What does it stand for?
Don't ask me questions. That's not how this segment works.
Sorry.
Come on. 255 people wouldn't be waiting to hear me answer questions. Okay, I want to ask a possibly quick question to Andy. Don't want to go right down the wind angle again, but Ian's asked a question that is something else we hear lots about. Ian says, what about the growth of invasive plants like ivy? Would this cause an increase in wind resistance and therefore failure? Something we're always hearing. The problem with ivy is that it creates this additional canopy which makes the trees fail.
Okay, I have to admit, I don't know a single study on that could provide data on this. I can talk from my experience and I can give you my opinion, but please regard it as an opinion and not something that I can prove. Because ivy, in general, ivy causes problems for trees, from my experience, only when the ivy actually makes its way to the periphery of the crown and overshadows young leaves in spring and causes really a dieback of the tree. Normally, when ivy is able to grow high in trees, it's because the tree is in strong decline, because ivy needs a lot of light. So it will remain along the stem and the stronger branches if the tree is in full vigor, usually. And as it is in the center of the crown along the stem and the stronger branches, these parts of the tree are exposed to much less wind speed in a storm than the periphery of the crown. You can imagine the crown of the tree to act like a filter, like what you have in your when you take water from your water tap. There's a little filter that makes this current of water into this nice percolated structure. This is what the canopy of a tree does to the wind. It just spreads it. And as a climber, I can tell you, I was in trees during storms, installing cabling as the storm was going on. Not a nice experience, but it's much less wind inside the crown than when you are next to the crown in a platform. When you're in the cherry picker, it blows you off. When you're anchored in the tree on the stem, it's shaky, but it's not as much. So the ivy is exposed to much lower wind speeds than the periphery of the crown, which for me makes it understandable that ivy will only increase the wind loading of a tree if it has already arrived in the periphery. And then that's the time when it damages the tree also biologically. So it's a good time to remove it. But as long as the ivy is on the stem and the larger branches, I would not expect any increase in the wind load of the tree.
Thank you very much, Andy. Right, I'm going to ask one very quick question, possibly a quick question, Philip, and then we're going to do our final question. Because where are we? Yanis has asked this a couple of times. Yanis is asking about the potential impact of the use of the electricity on the trees, Philip, when you're doing the work that is done with electronic testing. What is the impact on the tree cells?
That's shooting above my pay grade, I think, John. I
can give a little response.
My sense would be that the level of electricity is probably not problematic. But Andy, please speak to that.
The voltage is quite high, up to 100 volts, but the current is really low. So you have quite high electric, what's the English term for it? Voltage. I don't know the term.
We're good with voltage.
Voltage, but there's very little electricity actually moving, which is the ampere. Like the voltage is high and the ampere is really low. But is Lothar still attending? Lothar Göcke can probably answer this question because he's one of the technicians who actually developed this. And well, maybe he's not there anymore. But this is a question that is also a little bit beyond my knowledge. But I just know it is a big difference. What damages the cells would be the current, the ampere. If you have a lot of electricity passing through it, that damages. The voltage itself is not the problem. It's like basically you can compare it. You know these fences that you use for the cows. If you touch it, bang! This is high voltage, but you don't die. You don't get a burn. It's just high voltage and very little electricity running. And that's the same for the cells in the electric impedance tomography.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Very well explained. I also like it when our presenters call out members of the audience because now everybody knows that Lothar left early. So, Lothar, watch the recording. What are you doing? Okay.
Oh, this is boring. He knows all this stuff already.
Yeah, so some of our audience just watch to see if there's any mistakes. I know that some of them are out there. Okay, this is the final question, and you can all go home and do your thing. We are at home, you know what I mean? It's our favorite. What is your favorite tree book, or what tree book would you recommend to our viewers? Philip, let's come to you first. What's your recommendation?
Well, let me just see if I can share the screen for a moment and flash up. There we go. Do you see it?
Yes.
So this is one of my favorite books. It's hard to identify, to ask a tree guy what his favorite tree book is, but there's lots of them. But apropos to my discussion today, I didn't actually, because you were going to ask this question, I didn't mention it, but one of the, what I saw was perceived barriers to getting to Steve Sillett is I contacted him after this book was written. And this book is called The Wild Trees. It's written by Richard Preston. And it's basically talking about Steve Sillett and several other, not just Steve, but several other folks who were instrumental in this sort of search for the biggest and the best of the redwoods in the forest. And It's just, I mean, if you like my talk, it's all about, you know, those folks that spent time there. Now, of course, Richard Preston has taken some liberties to make it a good story, but in my opinion, it really is. And, you know, because this book was published before I approached Steve, that was one of the reasons why I thought, you know, there would be so many people trying to get a hold of him. So in any case, look up that book and read it up. You'll want to read it more than once, probably.
Great selection. Thank you very much, Philip. Andy, like everything else today, we asked you this at very short notice, but what's your favorite tree book?
Well, I brought it. I don't know if you can see. Oh, it's the wrong way around. Okay, hold on just a second. Bear with me. I hope I can do this.
I think it's the right way around. It's just it's in German, which is
no. It was also the wrong way around. But
no, it's looking good. It's looking good, Andy.
It's called Edward. Oh, this is horrible. Edward and the Last Tree, and it's a children's book about a boy who loves. Oh, let me do this. This is horrible. No.
It is the right way around. Oh, right. Now,
but now you see the actual background that I was hiding. This is my kids' room. And this is Edward and the Last Tree. It's about a boy who knows the last tree in the city and goes there to play. And one day somebody felled the tree. And it's about his story, bringing back from remnants of this tree, bringing back trees into the city and making the city basically changing the city from, this is not, I didn't practice this because I didn't have time. Otherwise I would have practiced. It's changing the city from this to ultimately this. And this is what I teach my kids about trees.
That's good. I think that's what we're all trying to do. Brilliant. Great. We all want to turn the cities a bit greener. That's a great choice. And Philip, also a great choice. Thank you. We're actually, for those of you who are members, in the next edition of the ARB magazine, we're sort of publishing a long list of all of the books that all of our presenters have recommended in the sort of 33 webinars we've done. So it's an interesting and eclectic list, and hopefully lots of inspiration there for you. Chris says, thanks, Philip. Your presentation has inspired him to sell his house, buy a plane ticket and go and climb some redwoods. So the Arboricultural Association bears no responsibility for anybody who sells their house as a result of watching our webinars.
Me neither.
Well, look, as always, to our presenters, Philip, Andy, thank you so much. They really were brilliant presentations. And I have to say particular thank you again to Andy, because this was short notice to say the least. And what a wonderful stand-in you've been. So thank you. And we'll be seeing you again at a future webinar, which is what we planned to do in the first place, but this was just a bit shorter notice. Philip, such an inspirational story. I think everybody is extremely jealous. So thank you to both of you. Thank you to all our audience, as always, for being so wonderful. Please think about signing up for our webinar in 2 weeks' time about Westernbert. Please, if you want to take pity on a tiny, desperate climate group, come and support the Stonehouse Community Climate Action Forum next week as well. And do all the other stuff. Be a member. Look at our webinars. All the stuff I normally tell you to do. Get well soon, Stefan. Hi from everybody from Stefan to Stefan. And thank you, everybody. Stay safe. And we really look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you very much. Good night.